The Mongol conquest was not merely a military campaign. It was an unprecedented act of social engineering executed on a continental scale. We often focus on the sheer terror of the cavalry charge and the swift fall of great cities, but the true brilliance and the core of the suffering lay in the meticulous, almost industrial, harvesting of human capital. This was not merely about seizing land and treasure. It was about stealing the minds and hands that built civilization, and then forcing them to build the Mongol Empire. The hook lies in acknowledging a terrible truth. The most feared military machine in world history was, ironically, dependent on the very people it conquered. The skilled artisans, the engineers, the scribes, and the metal workers of Persia, China, Rus, and Central Asia were the true prize of every siege. This was the dark calculus of the Mongol command. Chroniclers like Juvayni describe the terrible silence that followed the slaughter of the common soldiers and the citizenry during the fall of cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, broken only by the systematic sorting of the survivors. The process began with the siege. Mongol commanders, operating under the highly pragmatic guidance of the Yasa legal code, understood that indiscriminate slaughter was inefficient. The common soldier, or the useless civilian, might be put to the sword to sow terror and break the will of the next target. But the specialists, anyone whose labor was deemed indispensable, were meticulously segregated. We must analyze the psychological warfare inherent in this selection process. During the siege, the Mongols would force captured engineers and laborers to build the very siege engines and counter-fortifications used against their own people. This was a calculated act of dehumanization and compliance, turning the captive against their own community before they were even marched away. Upon victory, the inhabitants were lined up. The military men and political leaders were generally executed swiftly. The young, the old, and the sick were often abandoned or killed. But then came the crucial classification, the identification of the nukur, the essential artisans, scholars, and technicians. They were branded, marked, or registered immediately. The Persian chroniclers frequently detail how the Mongols, despite their illiteracy, recognized the value of the educated and the skilled. The man who could forge a superior sword, the woman who could weave fine silk for the Cossack, the Imperial Guard, the architect who understood complex vaulting. They were separated, their lives spared, and their servitude guaranteed. Their journey away from their homeland was the first agonizing chapter of the Mongol Yoke. These were the forced deportations that funneled expertise from the edges of the nascent empire, from Kiev and Baghdad to Karakorum and Sarai. The sheer scale of this human trafficking is staggering, yet it is often glossed over in favor of battle narratives. The slave trails, stretching thousands of miles, were pathways of immense suffering, but they were also the arteries of the new imperial economy, carrying the human talent that would power the Mongol administration, mint its coinage, and refine its luxury goods. When we consult the records, we see that the transfer of these captives was considered a matter of strategic importance, often being tallied in official reports alongside captured livestock and booty. Their survival was essential, but their status was absolute, property dedicated to the service of the Khan. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. The true measure of the Mongol yoke was not the speed of the horsemen, but the efficacy of the system designed to exploit the defeated. Once the captives survived the forced march, they entered the machinery of servitude, a highly differentiated legal and economic structure that utilized their skills to elevate the sedentary civilizations of the Mongol Empire. This is where we must engage in historical deconstruction and myth-busting. There is a common misconception of the Mongols as mere destructive barbarians. The reality is far more complex and terrifying. They systematically channeled the stolen genius of their conquered peoples, the very talent they had destroyed, into state-building projects of breathtaking scale. The legal status of these artisans and specialists was codified under the revised application of the Yasa. They were rarely considered simple chattel slaves in the same vein as those captured purely for agricultural or domestic work, though their subjugation was absolute. Instead, they were often defined as specialized state property. The term bo'ul, meaning slave or serf, encompassed a vast spectrum of bondage, but the skilled craftsman often fell into a unique category, sometimes informally referred to in documents as royal servants or kinin bogol, particularly in the Western Khanats like the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate. When we analyze the legal statutes, we find that these skilled laborers were, paradoxically, highly valued and rigorously controlled. They were routinely exempted from being sold in open markets, a crucial difference from the contemporary Islamic slave trade, because their skills were needed directly by the Mongol court or the immediate family of the Nyan, military commanders. This concentration of skilled labor led to the creation of imperial workshops known as ordos, or artisan colonies near the new administrative capitals like Karakorum, Sarai, and Tabriz. The economic function of this servitude was precise: to fuel the administrative and military complex. The Chinese metalworkers in the east refined the iron for weapons and armor. Persian architects designed the elaborate mosques and palaces of the Ilkhanate, demonstrating Mongol legitimacy to the settled population. Rus's jewelers, renowned for their fine gold work, were tasked with creating luxury items that served both as gifts for diplomats and as symbols of the Khan's overwhelming wealth and power. In essence, the captives became the technocratic backbone of the empire. Consider the city of Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde on the Volga. Archaeological evidence from the site shows clear segregation. The skilled captive population, which included not only craftsmen, but also doctors, astronomers, and engineers, lived in distinct quarters, their movements highly restricted, but their facilities often superior to those of the common population. This distinction wasn't benevolence, it was asset management. The empire needed their minds to be sharp, their hands steady, and their lives long enough to train the next generation of captive specialists. The human experience within this machinery was a perpetual, systemic, psychological toll. The record suggests a chronic state of uprootedness and fear. Captives were constantly subject to forced deportation, not just once, but multiple times, as Khanates splintered or new centers of power emerged. A Persian engineer might be captured in Baghdad by the Ilkhanate, serve for a decade in Tabriz, and then be gifted or requisitioned by the Golden Horde and marched north to Sarai. This lack of permanence ensured perpetual dependence on the Mongol system. Furthermore, the captives were integral to the Mongol tax and census system. The specialized artisans were not just producing goods, they were also being tallied as part of the total wealth that underpinned Mongol legitimacy. This system served as a model for later Russian and Ottoman institutions of serfdom and military recruitment, providing a direct, observable comparative history lesson. The use of state-controlled human resources as a primary pillar of imperial control. The resistance to this servitude was rarely overt rebellion, which was easily crushed by the well-organized Mongol military. Instead, resistance often took the form of passive sabotage, intentional mediocrity, or the preservation of cultural memory through craft. We must recognize the immense dignity in this. The scribe who subtly embeds his native language's motifs in a commissioned illuminated manuscript. The potter who intentionally uses traditional pre-Mongol techniques in state-mandated pottery. The architect who builds in a manner that favors the local climate over steppe traditions. These were small, profound acts of defiance. In this light, the Mongol Empire, despite its military might, was profoundly vulnerable. Its success was predicated on maintaining a vast, unhappy, and alienated workforce of intellectuals and artisans. As the Khanates began their inevitable decline, it was this very class of stolen genius that would first seek liberation, carrying with them the administrative, architectural, and technological knowledge they had been forced to perfect for their masters, ready to apply it to the rebuilding of their own shattered civilizations. The yoke was heavy, but the hands that bore it were learning their own strength. The true legacy of the stolen genius did not vanish with the decline of the unified Mongol Empire. Rather, it became integrated into the very fabric of the successor states, creating echoes and aftermath that profoundly shaped Eurasian history. The captive populations were not merely passive recipients of their fate. Through their forced labor and cultural contributions, they irrevocably altered the culture, technology, and administration of the Khanates they unwillingly served. As the centralized authority of the great Khans fragmented into the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty, the skilled captives found themselves in diverse, yet equally essential roles. In the Ilkhanate, for example, Persian astronomers like Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, though initially captured, were instrumental in establishing the Maragay Observatory. This institution, built with forced labor and financed by Mongol wealth, became a central hub of scientific advancement. Al-Tusi's work, which included the construction of instruments and the refinement of planetary models, represents the ultimate expression of the systemic oppression yielding unwilling yet profound cultural diffusion. The cultural assimilation was a two-way street, though weighted heavily by power dynamics. Mongol elites adopted the administrative and literary practices of their captives. The scribes from China and Persia taught the Mongol court the intricacies of settled governance, from tax collection and census taking to diplomacy and official record-keeping. This explains the rapid transition of the Mongols from a purely nomadic military force to sophisticated territorial rulers capable of managing diverse populations and vast internal trade networks. When we consult the historical documents, particularly the Secret History and later dynastic chronicles, we see a clear evolution in the complexity of their state apparatus, an evolution directly proportional to the forced absorption of foreign administrative talent. The long-term impact of this forced brain drain was transformative for the Mongol economy. The skills and infrastructure established by the captives became permanent fixtures. The forced migration of textile workers, for instance, led to the development of sophisticated silk production centers in Central Asia under the Ilkhanate that rivaled the old Chinese monopoly. Similarly, the Rus's metalworkers taken to the Golden Horde established specialized arms and armor industries that were crucial to the Horde's military dominance for centuries. The economic function of the enslaved transitioned from supporting a war machine to supporting a permanent, settled civilization. In the eventual weakening of the yoke, this captive class played a critical, if silent, role. Their specialized knowledge gave them leverage. Unlike field slaves, the Imperial artisans and scholars were difficult, often impossible, to replace. During periods of internal strife or succession crises among the Khans, the skilled populace could exert a subtle form of influence, often through non-cooperation or by seeking patronage from emerging local powers. The rise of figures like Timour, Tamerlane, who frequently relocated vast numbers of artisans from captured cities to his capital, Samarkand, demonstrates that this strategic transfer of human capital remained a defining feature of post-Mongol imperial strategy, echoing the original blueprint established by the Khans. The silent forms of resistance ultimately preserved crucial elements of the subjugated cultures. The architectural styles, the religious practices, and the literary traditions carried in the minds and hands of the captives were never fully extinguished. Instead, they were refined, adapted, and eventually re-exported back to the world, often infused with new influences gained during their forced tenure under the Mongols. This ensured that, while the physical structures of cities might be razed, the intellectual seeds were disseminated widely across the Eurasian landmass, ultimately fostering the resurgence of local civilizations. The Mongol yoke was broken not just by military defeat, but by the slow, inexorable power of the stolen genius that quietly rebuilt the world according to its own enduring cultural principles. The chain, though forged in iron, was ultimately worn down by the resilience of human ingenuity. The journey through the Mongol yoke, defined by meticulous law, massive forced labor, and the ultimate unwilling fusion of cultures, forces us to reevaluate the very meaning of empire. It shows us that power lies not just in armies, but in the possession and deployment of knowledge. The suffering was vast, the oppression systemic, yet the sheer persistence of human skill and cultural memory reminds us that even the most terrifying engines of history must ultimately rely on and eventually be shaped by the resilience of the human mind.